Washoe County Library System welcomes you to our monthly series, Nevada Historical Society presents High Noon with Neal Cobb. This afternoon's topic is Northern Nevada's Hebrew Cemeteries, presented by well-known Reno historian and author Sharon Honig-Bear. My name is Terry, and I'm so happy to be hosting here with you today. And now I am thrilled to introduce Sherry Hayes-Zorn with the Nevada Historical Society.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you, Washoe County Libraries, as always, for helping us to be able to share these wonderful programs, and specifically our High Noon series, getting it out there every month. And as they mentioned, we've got videos online, so if you've missed any of the past programs, please check them out. And we have some really great speakers lined up all the way through February, so make sure you check it out, or on our website, or also we also can send by email the latest happenings with the Historical Society. So check us out. So without further ado, I'm Sherry with the Nevada Historical Society, Curator of History, and I am so happy to introduce our host for the series, Neal Cobb. What a wonderful person he is, such a longtime supporter for the Historical Society. He's been helping us share Nevada history since 1988, and he is what we consider an honorary curator, helping us tell amazing stories in Nevada history. And without him, this program wouldn't be. So without further ado, let me introduce you, Neal Cobb. Hi, Neal.
Sherry, I hope I can live up to that introduction. It's my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today, Sharon Honig-Bear. Sharon's passion is Reno arts and cultural history. She is a freelance writer and photographer and was a restaurant critic for the Reno Evening Gazette, or the Reno Gazette Journal, or whatever you want to call it, for over 7 years, currently writing a column for Edible Reno Tahoe magazine entitled Edible Traditions. She is a board member with the Historic Preservation Society, the Reno Preservation Society, leads historic walking tours, and is a co-leader of the memoir writing group for Ollie. I want to expand just a second on the Historic Reno Preservation Society and their wonderful magazine that they send out periodically, because she is a major contributor, along with a whole bunch of talented writers and absolute research. They dig in for everything. These ladies and the guys, they are the very best. So it's worth the price of of being a member just to get that magazine. She neglected to say in her bio here, wasn't just a board member. She is now, but she was a president. The whole works on that. She's a major contributor to anything and everything that she gets involved with. She has lived in Reno for over 30 years, is a mother of 2 and grandmother of 4. So at this time, please welcome Sharon Honig-Bear.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank you not only for that introduction, for Neal. I'd like to thank the Nevada Historical Society and the Washoe County Library for setting up this whole series and allowing me the opportunity to talk today. So my topic is, as you can see right from the screen here, I hope you can see from the screen here, is on Northern Nevada's Hebrew cemeteries, and a little bit, and in Yiddish, which I know only a little, but in Yiddish, a little would be a bissel, about the early Jews of our region. And again, my name is Sharon, and my contact information you will see at my last screen. And the reason I say that is peppered throughout my talk today are things that people have contacted me after I've done this presentation previously with some additional information or clarification. So I'm always glad to hear from the people who watch this. So I often talk when I'm talking with Historic Reno Preservation Society about the city of Reno. But today I'm going to be talking about 3 cities of the dead, a term often used for cemeteries. It's a pretty fitting term also, since cemeteries, like the communities they serve, have a certain urban design or landscape. And as we tour today, these cemeteries, you'll see there are streets and park-like settings, and there's art and architecture, just like a living city. So I was living in Reno for only a few months, over 30 years ago, when I first encountered in something that I was reading about the Hebrew Cemetery, and I had no idea where this was. So in those pre-computer days, I called the Nevada Historical Society and said, where is the Hebrew Cemetery? And immediately I discovered a well-kept spot of green surrounded by college housing and urban bustle. It was located on the appropriately named Angel Street. And I'll be talking most extensively about the cemetery in Reno, but stay tuned for some interesting tales about the cemeteries in Virginia City and Carson City. The Hebrew Cemetery is located just west of the university. I do have, can you see, I don't know if you can see my little pointer here. So here's the university, and through here, this is where the Hebrew Cemetery is, just west. And it was constructed in 1878. And at that time, it was a very tranquil spot. The freeway was not built, obviously, yet. And at that point, you were just high on the hill above the developing city. The Hebrew Cemetery is surrounded by other noteworthy cemeteries. There's a whole complex of them up in that area. So on the top, you see the Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery, and the photo below is the Knights of Pythias Cemetery, again, right adjoining where the Hebrew Cemetery is. But the most historic of all is the Hillside Cemetery. Originally called the Reno Cemetery in 1860, the Hillside Cemetery was officially established in 1875. So it went through a transition and was renamed 15 years later, making it Reno's oldest. As you can see, and as many of you probably know, the Hillside Cemetery has suffered from severe neglect, vandalism, and threats from developers for decades now. But a dedicated group of volunteers is working to return the hillside to its former glory. Before we talk about the Hebrew Cemetery, I'd like to provide a little bit of context, a little bit of background about the Jews in northern Nevada. Jews were first drawn to Nevada from California in 1859 with the discovery of gold and silver on the Comstock lode. The gold and silver strikes brought a flood of immigrants from all corners of the country and, in fact, the world. Among them were Jewish engineers, storekeepers, traders, lawyers, journalists, doctors, and, of course, fortune hunters. Nevada's first directory, and this is an image of the first page, the cover page of the 1862 directory, listed 200 Jews in Virginia City, Gold Hill, Silver City, Austin, Dayton, Eureka, and Carson City. And I had this discussion based on a previous presentation where someone said, well, how did they know that there were about 200 Jews? Because really censuses and other indicators don't ask you for your religion. So if anybody has the answer to that, we've done a little bit of digging and not come up with what I think is a very satisfactory answer. But this is something I've read and pulled as fact, that the directory listed 200 Jews. But the question is, okay, I just listed all those other cities, Gold Hill, Silver City, etc. Well, how come Reno is not on there? because this is 1862 directory, and as most of you know, the city of Reno was not laid out until 1868 with the coming of the railroad. So here we know and meet Bertha and Mark Levinson. And the picture, which isn't so great, I admit, on the left is of Virginia City. And they were clothing merchants there. Mark Levinson was born in Holland, and in 1849, he moved to the United States. He was naturalized in 1855. And in 1862, he moved with his family to Virginia City, where they opened a clothing store. And in 1871, a devastating fire destroyed their home and business, along with 4 blocks of Virginia City. Okay, turning a page. Here we have a Comstock notable, Adolf Sutro, one of my favorite Western characters. A Prussian Jew in 1860, Sutro left San Francisco to come to Virginia City with plans to continue selling cigars. That was his plan. However, he came up with a much bigger vision, with the idea to build a tunnel to drain the water from the mines, to remove the threat of flooding for the miners. The Sutro Tunnel had difficulty being built, being funded really, despite the support of the miners who knew that their life would be improved with the existence of the tunnel. Finally, construction began October 19th, 1869, and it took almost 10 years for construction to conclude. But it did make Mr. Sutro the king of the Comstock, because it would drain 4 million gallons of water every single day. And the service was rented by the mine owners at an average of $10,000 a day. So Sutro left Nevada a rich man, and many of you may know he made a second mark for himself in San Francisco, the Sutro Baths, Sutro Heights, many different places in San Francisco. And that's a common pattern, that people made their money and finally, for whatever reason, left Nevada and moved on, usually to the Bay Area. So here's an early map of Reno. And Jews were among the early purchasers of lots when the city was first laid out in 1868. And again, I'm not sure where they get these statistics, but by 1900, Reno Jews numbered approximately 140 people. In the boom and bust economy of Nevada, population shrank and the Jewish communities in the mining towns faded away. Although they rarely numbered more than 1% of the population, Jews dominated Reno's dry good and clothing markets during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I like to, this is an early photograph. You can tell this is Virginia Street looking south. Behind us would be the railroad. And so this is the main drag, right? Commercial and Virginia Street. And right on this prominent corner, you'll see the Barnett store, Isaac and Thomas Barnett. They were brothers, obviously also in the dry goods store. But why I included here was because the families of the Barnett brothers were involved in the early Sabbath schools in Reno, attempting to educate and bring a little religion to the next generation. For context, there are currently 3 synagogues in Reno. This photo of the 1921 building of Temple Emmanuel, and I have to say, I have not found a better photograph than this, as bad as it is, how grainy it is. But this was located at 426 West Street between 4th and 5th Street. And in case you're wondering, it's now a parking lot across from the El Dorado. So Rabbi Harry Opachinski was the first rabbi. And when this was built in 1921, the joke was that the Jews could finally stop their wandering. The building cost at that time $35,000. It's made of baked brick. And let's see, I can point right over the entry arch. is a circular window, and you really cannot see it here. But according to my research, that circular window included a Star of David and the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. The Sabbath school, and I just mentioned the Sabbath school, although this building was later, was up on the second floor there. It was so significant to the community that Governor Boyle, Chief Justice Sanders, and other notables attended the laying of the cornerstone. Now, just 1 year later, when the building was finished, 200 people attended the high holiday services. Now, by 1969, the support timbers were rotting, and most of the congregants said, we can save this building, but the city condemned the building, and that was the end of that. The building was formally vacated at the end of the year, December 31st, 1970, and it was demolished, and as I said, it is now an empty lot. So what replaced it? The congregation didn't go away. This shows the new building in Reno Southwest at 1031 Manzanita Lane at Lakeside Avenue. And this particular congregation, Emmanuel, is affiliated with the conservative branch of Judaism. Well, in 1962, along comes a handful of Jewish pioneers following their vision to create a religious community that would better fit Reno's progressive Western culture. A little less orthodox, let's face it. So this is the way the original, as they were building the original temple, this is what it looked like. Even the parking lot wasn't paved. This is early. Some of you may recognize these names. The 7 families, pioneering families that created this community were the Dickens, the Garrells, the Garfinkels, the Browns, the Gumberts, the Cantors, and the Fieldings. And they established this Reform branch of Judaism. And this building, they bought some land, and it was constructed up in Northwest, what we would now call the Old Northwest, on Gulling Road. And there have been, as you can see, many expansions over the year. This is a side view. This is looking from the east. This is the old, the original building. This is some offices. There's a beautiful courtyard. And this side here is a library, classrooms, and I guess you'd call it a social hall. Honestly, there is an Orthodox congregation here, the Chabad of Northern Nevada, and it's existed for more than 20 years. They purchased and refitted a building at 1175 West Moana Lane. So back to the cemetery. So now you know a little bit about the community. This striking image appears to be the earliest photo of the cemetery. And as far as I could tell, this photo was taken in 1901. And you might notice, I mean, again, not easy to see, but you'll notice how very little there is still in this very undeveloped part of the city. So let's talk about the Hebrew Cemetery itself, introduce you to what makes this place unique, and why it's important to the Jewish community. And also I'll talk a little bit about some of the notables interred here. I want to point out to you right from the beginning that this is still an active cemetery. Graves are still being, people are still being interred here. And that the fact that it is still an alive cemetery, if you can say that, probably is a good reason why the cemetery looks as good as it does to this day. So a little bit to know about. This is what's called a consecrated Jewish cemetery. And it means that any of Orthodox or traditional customs will be followed. And that includes things like there will be no burials on the Sabbath. So no burials on a Jewish Sabbath goes from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. So you will not see a burial, or should not see a burial, on a Saturday. Also, part of Jewish tradition is to bury someone as quickly as they can. So these are the kinds of traditions that should be followed in a consecrated cemetery. This marker, I just like to, actually, I took this picture a little bit ago, but it was interesting for me because there's a tradition in Jewish life cycles where usually the person is buried without any kind of headstone or any kind of major marker. And usually on the anniversary, a year later of the person's interment, then there's a ceremony called the unveiling, where if there is a stone or whatever, that's the point it will be unveiled. And there's always a gathering of family or friends. So this one is a marker showing someone was buried there, but they had not yet come in and put any kind of more permanent marker. This is the only entirely Jewish cemetery in northern Nevada, although there are remnants of ones, as I will get to in a minute, in Virginia City and Carson City. Establishing a cemetery is one of the first priorities for a Jewish community, a new Jewish community. So only 10 years, you can see right from this beautiful metalwork, that only 10 years after the city of Reno was established, so followed the cemetery. Reno's Hebrew Cemetery is used by the synagogues, both, as I mentioned, Temple Emmanuel and Temple Sinai. But it is actually overseen and owned by a nonprofit called the Hebrew Cemetery Incorporated. So each of those two congregations pays dues for the cemetery's upkeep. And this is a good time to point out that the park-like setting is enhanced by, you'll see the thick green grass and shady trees as I go through my slides here. There are about 300 graves with maybe 12 spots available. I haven't seen if that needed to be updated. But unlike most cemeteries, individuals do not actually own their plot. You don't buy a plot and that's yours forever, including you may never be buried there. In the case of the Hebrew Cemetery here, the Cemetery Association actually retains ownership of the land. And people have what's called an easement of use to use the plot as needed. And because the association is overseeing the entire cemetery, that's what contributes to it looking so good. They're the ones who take responsibility for mowing the grass and maintaining the trees and items like that. So now, how did this cemetery even get, see, these pictures are better, I took them. The job of establishing the Hebrew Cemetery fell primarily to David Lockman. He was a local merchant, and he purchased some of those original lots in Reno in 1868. Mr. Lockman is buried in the cemetery with his wife, Harriet. And when he moved here, and again, these were the fledgling years for Reno, he created a Reno Hebrew Benevolence Society in 1879 to assist newcomers. And because at that time there may not have been a rabbi, he was often called on to lead high holiday services. Lockman knew Jacob Davis, a Jewish merchant he met in Virginia City in 1861. But of course, Jacob Davis moved down to Reno and had a store. And that's where I really believe that's where Mr. Lockman and Jacob Davis developed a much closer relationship. And just in case Jacob Davis's name didn't mean anything, Davis was the originator of the riveted pants, and he was joined by Levi Strauss in San Francisco to patent what we now know as blue jeans. And in this case, this is an early photograph of, we're looking north on Virginia Street, and you can see what a wild and woolly Western town we were. The streets weren't paved, animals, dogs, cat, horses just could walk into stores. But this stretches where Jacob Davis's shop was. And if you've ever walked up or down, doesn't matter which way you go, on North Virginia Street, just north of 2nd Street, you will see a freestanding historical marker indicating this was where his Jacob Davis's tailor shop was. And as you can see, it's so cleverly done in the shape of a riveted blue jean pocket. It is interesting to me that after extensive research, I failed to find a photo of Mr. Lockman. But when he died on November 3rd, 1901, you can see his obituary here. The Reno Evening Gazette headlined it, "Death of an Old Resident." And because the print is kind of hard to read, I'm just going to read you a section. He came to Reno and located when the town consisted of but 1 or 2 houses. In fact, he was among the earliest buying property from the railroad company that is today one of the best pieces of property in the city. In the cemetery, on the right here, you can see the entry steps to his plot. And here is the actual headstone for him and for his wife, Harriet. The newspaper obituary went on to say he was laid to rest at 3 o'clock, and a large number of his friends of the Pioneer followed the remains to this place. By the way, David's brother Benjamin had an equally impressive grave site. And sadly, David's wife, Dora, died very young, but she was notable, and I understand this to be true, as the first person to be brought for burial in a motorized hearse. So here's kind of a longish view. You can again see trees, you can see grass. I've taken a lot of these photos at different times of the year. I think this is, the grass is looking a little dry right here. But the cemetery is now established. So let's look at some of the features as we walk through the site. And I like to point out that there are headstones, there are footstones, or flat gravestones. And also you can see some of the tall markers that we'll be talking about, the elaborate statuary. There are also some old wooden markers. The wooden markers are about 100 years old, and you can see, sadly, fading to the elements. There are even 13 unknown graves. There were no records of these, but when work was being done to consider a site for a new burial, they found remains, and they have not been able to establish who was in those graves. So let's take a look at some of the key features, actually typical of any cemetery this old. You'll see many infants and children's graves. And I just have to bring up this statistic because it always breaks my heart. Infant and neonatal mortality during this period was high, as you would expect. About 150 of every 1,000 children under 1 year, this was about 100 years ago, died. And this number, 150 out of 1,000, actually may have been underreported because often stillborn children, babies, were not reported. Just to compare, we currently are at about 5 out of every 1,000 infants under 1 year are succumb. So in this particular case, you see the white marble headstone for Newton Abrams, and it was topped by a gentle lamb. The gentle lamb, or I don't know if it's gentle, the lamb motif graces the graves of these 2 brothers, the Simpson brothers, Jerome and Ronald, who died at 9 years old and at 7 years old. Especially in the older monuments, we see a great deal of artwork, and there's an entire language associated with the images on tombs. Similar to the antique symbolism associated with flowers or gemstones or other Victorian objects. As we saw a moment ago with the sleeping lambs indicating innocence, There's also the symbolism of a draped urn. And when it's a draped urn or a vessel, and usually that denotes mourning, a veil cutting off a person from their world, from their earthly world. Notice at the very, this is another thing I do want to point out. At the very top of this headstone, I already have, I guess, a little arrow pointing. This headstone from Morris Nathan, who died in 1909. There are two Hebrew letters here, Pei and Nun, and they stand for, they're like a shorthand in Hebrew for Pol Nikbar, which translates as here lies, which is common in headstones, even in English, but here this is often found in Jewish cemeteries or Hebrew cemeteries. And I don't think I say it anywhere else. Of course, you're going to see Hebrew on many of these headstones. The Star of David is probably the most recognized Jewish symbol, appearing on the flag of Israel and coming from King David's shield. You'll notice on this headstone, there's something that's kind of interesting, and you won't find this in a non-Jewish cemetery. There are two names there. The deceased is Rebecca K. Silverman, but it also has her Hebrew name. Rebecca translates as Rivka. Bas means she is the daughter. Bas means daughter. Avraham, so it is Rebecca, daughter of Abraham. Rachel Friedlander's monument, it's just jam-packed with all kinds of symbolism. So you've got the Star of David, but on either side of that are carved laurels and oak leaves. Laurels denote someone's remaining evergreen in your memory. Oak leaves on gravestones were very popular in the 19th and 20th century because they symbolize longevity, strength, and power. Also, because the oak produced many little acorns that would grow and in turn create more oak. So there's a sense of the oak being eternity. I do want to point out, it's very interesting to me that the Hebrew letters here, usually Hebrew, unlike we read English from left to right. Hebrew is read the opposite way. And so whoever carved this stone probably didn't get that because these letters are in the wrong order. Another recognizable Jewish symbol is hands spread out in the priestly blessing. And yes, I know about this Trekkies. It indicates that the interred is a descendant of Aaron, the prophet, high priest, and the elder brother of Moses. Another recognizable symbol is the candelabra or the menorah. And it's a Jewish symbol representing universal enlightenment. It's generally used on the graves of women as a symbol of how women bring light to others. This lovely stone incorporates two lions representing Judah, who was the fourth son of Jacob, and his tribe was represented by a lion. And Jewish people are said to have come from the tribe of Judah, and that's why you will sometimes see lions as a symbol. There are modern and some unique headstones too, mostly where we bring in more modern thoughts on life and death. So this headstone was probably done in 2020, and you will notice very modern. Yes, it does have the Star of David, but it also has a golf bag. And this one has a Masonic symbol, but it also has showing his connection to military service. I was surprised to find this stone recently. It was the first one I had ever seen that incorporated, I guess it's a new technique, which actually incorporated a photo image. I had to include this funny headstone, okay? There can even be humor in a cemetery. It gives me a laugh every time I saw it. But I always thought it was sad that Sam's name was never included. It was just here comes Sam and there goes Sam. And in case you didn't figure it out, I cannot read Hebrew other than a small smattering. So I have to thank Lene Gralla for the following information about this stone. I had done this presentation previously and Lene got in touch with me. And her research found that this is the grave of Samuel Feinhandler, who was born in White Russia in 1898, and he died in Elko. She notes that the Hebrew on the stone is entirely traditional, and it concludes with a common kind of prayer: may his soul be bound up in the bond of life. One last thing before we move on, about symbols and what you will see often carved on these stones. This is a common practice to leave a stone at the grave of a loved one. It's rooted in ancient times, and throughout the centuries, the tradition has become part of the act of remembrance. In other words, it's a way of saying someone cared enough to visit this site, this grave. Sandra Medvins, and you can see that this is what the stone I'm indicating here. She had a whole lineup of rocks when I was visiting at one point, including some probably from grandchildren, vividly painted ones, and they had heartfelt comments like, I miss you, and one had a heart and kisses. Of course, stones don't stay in one place. So on any given visit, you might see them in different places or moved around. But one thing that I liked about this one is not only were there the collection of the stones, but again, we can make, people can make even in death, they can live as their life with what's important to them. And obviously to look at this, you're seeing that they had a love for dancing. Many gravestones proudly announce the country of origin for the interred. And in this cemetery, the immigrants mostly came from Eastern Europe. Thanks to Dean Miller, who heard this presentation previously, and he helped me with the German, which said, to the memory of my, at the bottom it said, to the memory of my beloved son, and at the very bottom it said, rest in peace. Ruhe, I can't speak German, in Frieden. So thank you for all of you who contribute. And here's an angel on here too, although obviously not for a child. I've already shown you Rachel Friedlander's headstone, but I repeat it here because she hailed from Saverne, Alsace. And I was interested that there are 5 graves indicating a connection to Alsace-Lorraine. So my colleague Steve Matlis explained to me, because I was a little surprised by that, that the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had its effect. In 1871, the region was transferred from French jurisdiction, where the Jews were living comfortably, to German rule. And at that point, there was an exodus from the region, and Reno was one of the beneficiaries. Reno became, like many other places, a refuge city. Here is a repaired grave for Nathan First, who was a native of Germany. And again, many of the people interred here, the older graves, hailed from Eastern Europe. So we had Russia, Hungary, and Warsaw, just to name a few. This headstone indicates that Mr. Abrams was born in Poland. I started to dig deeper into the history of some of the early interred. And Jacob Cohen is a good example. His obituary called him, I had never heard his name before, quote, an old merchant of Comstock days in the 1860s. And he had a store called the White House Clothing Store. So it was up in Virginia City. It went on to say the news of his death was, quote, sadly received sadly by his old friends. He amassed a fortune, but was ruined by the big fire of 1877, which destroyed a large portion of the city and ruined thousands. And he's another case where he tried to get reestablished, and then eventually he moved to San Francisco. Beyond their nationality, another source of pride for many of the Jews who were buried here was their military service. The oldest marker is for the Spanish-American War with veteran Corporal Mark Robinson, who served in 1898 in the 1st Nevada Infantry Company A. And I didn't know anything about that, so I did a little bit of work. This was with the Spanish-American War. And actually, this Nevada Infantry Company A never did service outside of the country. He served in the continental US. His dates were not on the headstone, which is interesting, but some research found that he was born in 1860 and died in 1927. I love that his nickname was Moxie, and he was a resident of Reno for more than 30 years. Many other graves of veterans are marked with their military service. Here you have Samuel Blatt, who was a captain in the Medical Corps. Dr. Blatt was a member of Temple Emmanuel and a physician for many years at the Veterans Hospital. Then there's Private Robert Shimkovsky, who served in the Signal Service during World War II. Native of Oakland, California, he was buried with full military honors. Now, I put this in not because he really had any military service, but it's a name that many people will know. My place here. This was Robert's father, and although he had no military service that's indicated, Ira began Shim's Army surplus on Sierra Street in 1945, but then there was a flood at the store and he relocated to 125 West 3rd Street, where it continued to service the people of Reno. It was quite popular, and now has been reborn as a speakeasy influence bar called Shim's. You have to get in from the rear. Others serving during World War II and showing their pride of military service, and I'm not even covering all of them, was Arthur Gould and Sergeant Emanuel Ash, George Madison, Sergeant George Madison, and Sergeant Irving Margulis. Reuben Chladni, who served in the Navy. Corporal Lee Saman, who served in Korea. I think you get an idea of how important military service to our country was. I noticed one new thing recently that I wanted to show you. It's the grave of William Libovic, because there's a medallion that I had never seen before, Holocaust survivor. This story is way too long for me to go into any detail, but just to sum it up, he was born in Hungary, and he survived many, many obstacles, including passing as a Christian. And he and his wife finally got visas, lived for 17 years in Santiago, Chile, and he emigrated to the US in 1963 when the political situation in Chile was deteriorating. So if you take a wide view, these are close-ups of looking at those two themes, their military service. And so here, take a wide view, your eye will go to these three tall monuments, the three tall markers for the pioneering families, and I'll spend a minute talking about each of them. The Shire, Levy, and Jacobs families were early Northern Nevada pioneering families, and each monument, and I mentioned this before, is topped with a draped carved urn. Jacob Shire was born in Warsaw, where he became a rabbi, married Amelia, and had 3 daughters. They moved to Carson City in 1863. He brought much needed religious practices with him, and the Daily State Register conferred the title Rabbi for the state of Nevada on him in 1872. In this close-up, you'll notice that his monument, did I make? In this close-up, you notice that his monument says Warsaw, Russia, not Poland, reflective of how the country boundaries changed at this time. During his life, he owned a women's clothing shop located where the Capitol now stands in Carson. And after his death, Amalia operated the store, raised her 3 daughters, and both of them, Jacob and Amalia, are buried here in the cemetery. The family dynasty was carried on when one of the Shire daughters married Saul Levy, who erected another pillar for our brother Fred Levy. Saul joined his brother Fred Levy and Brothers in Reno in 1881. And I just like to point out that Saul and his brother are not related to William Levy, who lived in what is now Sundance Books and who had that beautiful emporium on Virginia Street. The last pillar marks the Jacobs family plot. Father Solomon was an early Reno merchant and civic leader. Called a Reno pioneer, he was given the honor of shoveling the first spade of dirt during the groundbreaking for Temple Emmanuel, which I showed you just a few minutes ago. His wife, Hannah, and other family members are also buried here. And just an interesting footnote, it was pointed out to me that stone carvers were in short supply in the early days of Reno, and some headstones and funerary art could be ordered from catalogs. And some might even, more expensive ones, might even be imported from Europe. So the final carving of names and dates could easily be accomplished with local workmen, but the more elaborate carvings could be done somewhere else. It is unclear whether these examples follow that, but after I did this presentation last year, Lene Gralla, whom I mentioned before, contacted me with a wealth of additional information. She said she was surprised that so many of the memorials, even the early ones, are so non-traditional. Perhaps the absence of a Jewish stone carver in Reno was the reason. She added, I think it is unusual that the area where the individual immigrated from is carved on the stone as well. I don't know if that's unusual, but I love that it's there. There are other notables to talk about. I like to call it a walk among the notables, and some names here will sound familiar to you if you've lived in this community for a while. Harry Parker was co-owner of Parker's Western Wear, a Reno tradition since 1919. It catered to locals and famous customers like Walter Matthau, Jerry Lewis, Bill Cosby, and Cary Grant. Harry came to work for his brother in 1945 after fighting in World War II and bought the business in 1966. His gravestone says, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, and I love this part. He loved life, family, people, and the city of Reno. Abraham Zatuni put Reno on the map when he built the Art Deco-styled Hotel El Cortez in 1931. He was born in Damascus, Syria. He came to Reno in 1920. He opened the Silk and Linen shop and the Vogue. These were very high-end women's fashion stores. When he opened the El Cortez, it was the tallest building in Reno, and it was designed, this was right at the broadening of divorce trade, and it was designed for a wealthy clientele. Another grave there is Joseph Zatuni, and he was Abe's nephew. He served for 25 months overseas in World War II, and he earned a variety of war medals and ribbons. And he was in his uncle employed him as a clerk at the Vogue shop. And then after the Vogue shop closed down and was sold, Joseph bought the liquor store next door. Then we have Nathan Belaski, who came to Reno from Russia in 1914, and in A Common Path for Jews, he started as a junk peddler and with prosperity opened a scrap metal yard, eventually investing in real estate. 3 of his sons, the Belaski brothers, leased the El Cortez property from Abe Zatuni, adding the legendary Trocadero showroom, where it featured notables such as Chico Marx, Victor Borga, and many others. By the way, a viewer from a previous presentation pointed out that son Joseph Pulaski went on to develop iconic restaurants in Southern California. One of the joys of doing research is discovering a new story. This is the case with Martin Kronberg, 1911-1981. He moved to Nevada in 1941 and was a pilot for 56 years. But what really caught my interest was that he was the first licensed crop duster in Nevada. During World War II, he was a flight instructor at Yellen Airport in Ely, then manager of the Sparks and Carson City airports. Other merchants with names that might sound familiar depending on how long you've lived here include Teddy Bear Havas, and this was from Havas Motors, and Simeon Edises from Edises Jewelers. The cemetery is well kept, and this has kept vandalism to a minimum, but I was surprised when I came across this photo showing the Levy monument toppled, and obviously it has been repaired. A special community memorial service takes place each fall on the Sunday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rabbis gather and provide prayers. As I mentioned earlier, this is still an active cemetery, and in fact, the Cemetery Association realized some time ago it was running out of room. It prompted the purchase of the decommissioned street to the south of the current facility. And fundraising for this project is currently underway. This is just a sketch of one of the things that is planned. It's estimated that the expansion will serve the community for another 100 years, keeping a tradition that goes back to 1878. Not all Hebrew cemeteries have fared as well as the one in Reno. I will briefly mention the fate of the ones in Carson City and Virginia City. I owe a debt of gratitude to a researcher named Sue Silver, bringing to light the Hebrew Cemetery in Carson City. The present Lone Mountain Cemetery, the map doesn't even include the Hebrew grounds at all, nor is it marked as such. This cemetery is administered, I thought this was kind of odd, and supervised by the Carson City Department of Parks and Recreation. So maybe they should hold a dance there. According to available, so the present Lone Mountain Cemetery doesn't map the Hebrew grounds at all. I already said that. According to available records, there were originally 7 separate cemeteries, which were formed into this one cemetery now known as Lone Mountain in 1971. There were sections for the Masons, Oddfellows, Catholics, Babyland, Hebrew, Grand Army of the Republic, Veterans, and a city cemetery section, which dated back to early territorial days. So this 40-acre site represents a unique cross-section of early day Nevada. On a recent visit, so I was trying to figure out where are the Jewish graves. I tried to envision the map as I headed out to the northwest corner, and I just didn't find anything marked at first, but then I saw the 10 Commandments, this monument from 1974, constructed by the Fraternal Order of Eagles. So I figured I must be in the right category, because here was a Star of David, and so I decided I would continue walking through the dirt and through the dust. And as I'm passing some old headstones, I did find out that some of these oldest headstones came from Abe Curry's quarries. And his quarries are where the Nevada State Prison on 5th Street is currently located. The Jewish residents of Carson City, many of whom were early settlers in the town, at the town of the gold and silver discoveries on the Comstock, just like they did in Reno, they acquired land for the cemetery. By March in 1862, the Carson Hebrew Benevolence Society for $150 purchased 2 acres of land. This image shows an overview of this section. I finally found it, this section of the cemetery. This fairly recent map indicates in yellow the area that has been historically the Hebrew cemetery. That's when I said when I arrived, I just kept heading north and west until I found some stones and indication that this might be a Hebrew cemetery. The earliest marked burial in the cemetery dates to 1873. And the history of Carson City suggests that there should be older graves, but this is what we found. There are still burials taking place here as well. And unlike I just have to point out that unlike the Reno Cemetery, all these graves are basically surrounded by rock and dirt. The next slide provides a close-up of several of the graves. And as in Reno, the older markers are often more elaborate, and you'll notice Hebrew along with the English. Many of the historic grave sites use the letters FLT and interlocking chain links. A little research led me to the fraternal group, the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. And the FLT stands for Friendship, Love, and Truth. And the chain links link those values. This lovely monument kept stone masons busy. It shows Mr. Harris was not only an odd fellow, a Jew with the Star of David, but also a mason. There are many smaller stones like the one on the right, and quite a few of the stones are broken or laying flat away from their mountings. I enjoyed exploring the stories of some of the interred, and I'll give you a sense of a few of them. And I was surprised in some cases how unique their stories were, and that these stories were new to me. Perhaps the most notable grave is for Abe Cohn. He is best known for identifying Datso Lali and her stunning baskets. Cohn was well-known resident and merchant in Carson City for more than 30 years. And I did find it interesting that his wife got a more elaborate head than he did. He was born in California in 1859, and he spent his boyhood in Bodie. In 1882, he moved to Carson, where he opened a mercantile and clothing store. But he began collecting basket works of the Washoe Indians. I think he thought they were beautiful, and he started to collect them. And soon his hobby overshadowed his other mercantile business. And he renamed his store the Kit Carson Curio Store. And he built up a large trade. I can hear thunder outside my window right now. Abe discovered, which is not really true, Datso Lali's talents. He certainly capitalized and recognized them. She was working for his family as a housemaid, and he encouraged her to keep alive the art of basket weaving. And this is a copy of his obituary. Now it's raining in my neighborhood. This was a great story. Another resident with an interesting story is Morris. He's sometimes known as Mendel, which would have been his kind of Yiddish name, Ashheim. He was a pioneer barber. Now, normally I wouldn't bring up a barber, but I didn't bring him up. Dan DeQuille did, and I'm hoping most of you know something about Dan DeQuille. And he was writing in the Virginia Enterprise, and this is what he wrote about Mr. Ashheim. Ashheim was one of those who rushed to Meadow Lake at the time of the mining excitement at that place. He opened a shop under a tree. We had the first shave at the new shop, and once or twice during the operation, Morris threw down his razors and took up the pick in order to regulate a leg or two of the chair. He had his combs, brushes, and other tools stuck up against the trunk of the tree. And was loud in his boast of having the biggest and best lighted barber shop in the world. The shop was a success from the start. Sometimes in my research, I come across stories that I had no idea existed, and that's the case with Hirsch Harris. He was a well-known figure in political life at the Capitol for years. He had a career both as a state senator and member of the assembly representing Douglas County. But this is where the story gets crazy interesting. Politics wouldn't be enough for me to mention it. Harris was also known for his distinguished career as a melter and refiner for the Carson City Mint. Harris noticed that a lot of gold bullion was missing in 1895 and 96, over $77,000 worth back then. And eventually he was recognized for bringing attention and for his honesty to recognize that this money was missing. And he became a witness for the prosecution. This is a story in itself, what happened, the court, the trials, who died, who went to jail. But I can't go into that detail today, but I wouldn't have even been on the trail of this story if I wasn't tracking down Hirsch Harris's burial spot. I could go on with other stories, but I'll end with Joseph Platt. His obituary from the Daily Appeal in 1907 said, quote, "A pioneer merchant of Carson closes his long account with life." I do love these poetic descriptions. It was said that he passed away peacefully with a smile upon his face, as a man of his good and peaceful life might well afford to die. His obituary said he came from Germany and at 16 made the trip to California via the Isthmus of Panama. And he came to Carson City in 1862, established a clothing business, and he was recognized as one of the leading and most successful merchants of the state. And this is a quote: "His acquaintances reached every portion of Nevada." And this wonderful photo shows him on the right, standing in front of his shop, and you can just make up at the top, Joseph Platt. It goes on in the obituary to say his life in Carson City was an unblemished record for integrity in his dealings, and if he ever had an enemy in Nevada, the Appeal never heard of it. And this photo, I love this photo. You can tell I love all the photos. This photo shows him in the yard of his home at 402 North Curry Street. Joseph's more notable brother, Samuel Platt, is actually buried in the Masonic Cemetery in Reno. Samuel was a distinguished lawyer, politician, and public servant in early 20th century Nevada. So before I leave, we're going to take a quick visit up to Virginia City for a visit to the cemetery there, which is located more than a half-mile north of the rest of the cemeteries. It's difficult to find, and the site is not connected to the rest of those cemeteries. So just a personal funny note, I thought it was funny. Some of you may know tour leader and writer Deborah Hemden, a good friend of mine. She's always game for a history adventure, and a few years ago, we headed to Virginia City for me to go to the Hebrew Cemetery. And unfortunately, it was winter, as you can see, and a particularly snowy one at that. We headed down the unpaved road to the Hebrew Cemetery, and so far, so good. And then we got stuck, and no amount of rocking or reverse or curses would move us forward. Thank goodness for cell phones, and the sheriff was with us surprisingly soon. It must have been a quiet weekday in Virginia City, and he hitched us up to his truck and got us out, and we decided to abort our mission for that day. During the height of the Comstock, the cemetery, which is known here as the Jewish Cemetery, served the burial needs for Virginia City's thriving Jewish community. The cemetery was established in 1863 and was described at the time as a very handsome plot of ground. This marker at the site identified 23 burials, the oldest in 1863, which was the year the cemetery was first established. It wasn't easy to find out much about those who were interred. Jules Hamburger was born in 1812 and died in 1867. He was an assayer, which was an important profession on the Comstock. Aaron Korn was only 10 months when he died and was one of the first burials here. Most of the women led nowhere. They're cold trails. I did find out a bit about Louis Reeb, who died in 1874 at 59 years. He was a native of Silesia, Germany. His name was Louis Ribitsky, and he, like many immigrants, shortened his name, and in this case, from Ribitsky to Reeb. His brother Mark is also buried here. The last burial was in 1897 with Isaac Cohen. All I could find out about him was that at his death, the court appointed an administrator for his estate. And you can see the damaged gravestone in this photo. As the Comstock mining activity ebbed in the late 1880s and 90s, Virginia City's population began to shrink. And as a result, the cemeteries, including this cemetery, fell into disrepair. And over the next 100 years, desert vegetation reclaimed the landscape. Periodically, congregations and service clubs have come to clean up the site. Unfortunately, the cemetery has been the subject of vandalism on many occasions during the last 100 years. Headstones have been destroyed or defaced, and in some cases, just removed. And the cemetery has generally been desecrated. Fortunately, there has been efforts to recognize the cemetery and identify some of the deceased. A significant marker was set up in stone in 2005. Although, interestingly, it's placed up near the rest of the cemeteries, not where the actual site of the cemetery is. But as I've shown you before, and you can see the fence now that the cemetery is completely enclosed in a big fence, that's the site, the marker at the site itself. A fence has been erected, as I mentioned, and periodically cleanup crews come from area synagogues and local historical groups. This one was a number of years ago from a group from Temple Sinai in Reno. And by the way, that star has long gone. A more recent cleanup effort, I believe this is by a group from the Chabad of Reno. And as I've indicated, I am not, well, maybe I didn't indicate, but it's never too late to say, I am not an expert on this topic. I'm grateful to the massive amounts of information that can be gleaned from the internet, from Find a Grave, newspapers.com, just to name some of them. But if you're really interested to dive in deeper about the Jews in Nevada, there's no better source than John Marshall's book. This well-researched book came out in 2011 and still available. While the focus of this presentation has been Jewish cemeteries in northern Nevada, the stories of Jews in Nevada go on. As of 2017, Nevada's Jewish population was approximately 76,300 people. Jews have always been one of Nevada's most active and influential ethnic minorities. They were among the state's earliest Euro-American settlers, and from the beginning they have been involved in every area of the state's life as businessmen, agrarians, scholars, educators, artists, politicians, and civic, professional, and religious leaders. I'd like to thank you for taking this virtual journey with me. And as I mentioned several times throughout my presentation, my work has been enriched by other people who have let me know additional information. So this is how you can reach me, either by phone or email. I prefer email. I'm always glad to hear from you. And I encourage people to go look at historicreno.org to link to many other enlightening stories about our area and our unique history. And I hope to see you another time. Thanks.
That was wonderful, Sharon. Thank you so much. So I'm going to read some of the chat questions for you that from the audience. So the first question is, were there any artifacts saved from the demolition of Temple Emmanuel? And do you know anything that happened? Did they try to preserve the round stained glass window?
I can tell you that again, there the same way that there really were not good photos. One photo that I did not put in here because I pared this down from I think about an 1.5-hour presentation. So anytime you pare things down, you're going to take things out, right? Yeah. I had a slide that's really kind of cool. At Temple Emmanuel on Lakeside, they have the cornerstone of the original 1921 synagogue. And you have they have a photograph. I must have picked it up, I think, from the internet somewhere. Do you have that, Neal? But you can see the two cornerstones side by side. So they did save that. As far as I know, nothing was saved from the window. That would have been really difficult to do.
But that's exciting. I did not know that about them saving the other cornerstone. So yeah, that's a great piece of history there. Okay, so the next question is, who painted the Jewish death scene? I noticed that the mirror is covered, which I know is a custom. What other traditions are depicted? So I missed that. So was that depicted on one of the headstones, or?
You know, when I was talking about, let's see if I can get back there, or maybe it doesn't matter. It was early. And when I pulled that image from the internet, and I really don't know who, if there was provenance even there. Because a lot of times it's folk art, you know, but it was a deathbed scene, and they were preparing the body, and I just use that to talk about how certain traditions, if you are a consecrated cemetery, you do follow certain things. So if the question is what else is often done there, the washing of the body is really really important, and I think that scene might have recognized that. Traditionally they would cover mirrors, and I always thought, but again, I don't mean to go on too long, the draping of the urns that I talked about when I say it denotes mourning and a separation from the current life to the future life, I think all of that is very traditional, but I can't help but think in Jewish burial, it might also have that sense of covering the way that mirrors are covered. And I think somehow those are related, but I didn't dig deep on that, but I can't help but think that covering the urn is not just a separation from life, but maybe that's why the mirrors are covered too. Also, because I believe nobody wants to be seen as vain. You should not be thinking of yourself at the death of a loved one. Your concern should be for that person's soul and that kind of thing. And I'm just trying to think, is that enough of an answer? I'm sure there are a lot of other, you know, the period of sitting Shiva, which in Hebrew it means 7, that 7 days after the burial. You know, there are very strict things about what you do, and it's really kind of cool. I mean, I don't know who does it anymore, at least in Reno, but for 7 days you don't do anything, and people come to you and they bring you food and they take care of you with your covered mirrors. You know, so I mean, I can remember that from when I was a girl, but I don't know how much this tradition, you know, especially in Reform congregations and stuff, carries on at all. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's a few, but no, that makes sense. And also, I think also it was the Victorian time period too, you know, and established mourning. And yeah, absolutely. It was like the draping of the self, and then the question of the soul in the mirror. So there's many things, but yeah, I think that's pretty amazing. So there is a question or just a comment. I've always looked at the Jacob Davis plaque a zillion times, but I never noticed it was a jeans pocket. Mind blown.
Oh, no.
I've always loved it. That was the jean pocket, but
Yeah,
I
me
imagine
too.
just kind of looking at it, you're not paying attention, but I think it's a pretty cool.
Well, also
plaque.
because
They
it's
put a lot of
right in the
time.
middle of the walkway. You're just glad you don't run into it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's cute.
I thought so too. There's another comment. The gravestones are not coated in chocolate like paint like they are at the Mountain View Cemetery. You know how their water source, when they water the lawns, has changed the color to several of the headstones. Do you
Yeah.
know why? These stones should be pristine. So I know that I had this conversation with Lori at one point, but I'm curious if you know anything else. But back in early 2000, when I was working on this on my Keith Pittman exhibit, and I went up there and took pictures of their funeral marker and all of that, that it was very clean. But since then, their water system for watering their lawns has changed, and so now you start seeing the discoloration to a lot of
So
like
interesting.
Nixon, like the big monuments that
Yeah.
along there, that has changed the color to a lot of them. Now, of course, over time they will change, but I don't know if you've heard anything.
No, and I will look into that.
Okay.
I did reference my friend Steve Matlis, who is on the Cemetery Association. And do you know, when you're talking about some of these other cemeteries with this discoloration, do they use recycled water? Is it possible?
That's my thought, that it's not like the main water, that it could be secondary, maybe it's gray water. I don't know, but I know it's something associated with the different
Yeah,
water. And
I
so
didn't.
yeah.
I don't know. Even as I was showing that, I think it was Dora Lockman, there was some white streaking, but I mean, first of all, that is a pretty old stone, but overall the stones looked good. And what I didn't make a comment on, you can only say so much given a limited amount of time, but there was somebody, stone, who maybe Nathan, I don't remember, but where the stone, he died over 100 years ago, and this stone is in really good shape. And it makes me wonder if it was redone, because I don't think any stone that's over 100 years old looks as crisp. I mean, this is stone, but still I'm using the words crisp and clean as this one did. So there's always questions that come up.
Well, yeah, and sometimes things have gotten damaged and vandalized, and so, or completely taken. So do family members replace them, or depends on the type of stone materials, like marble versus other that. But yeah, even over time, I mean, they start, like you said, the crisp edges and stuff start to weather. So they're not as crisp,
Well, they look better than I do, so.
Yeah, they would look good. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there's another question. Would Jewish people join some of the other organizations like the Elks and Moose, and therefore be buried in their sections in early cemeteries? One gravesite you showed had the Mason symbol, so he could have been buried in the Masonic section. So was there at the time like no Jewish cemetery? I know that just in general, historically, there was a lot of, early on, people were part of more than one organization and more than one fraternal order for benefits and different opportunities, because you could get death benefits. That was definitely an opportunity for being buried. But I don't know if you know, because you were saying didn't you say Carson City was 1862 when they established theirs? Isn't that about the time frame, or 63 or something like you were mentioning? Yeah.
Well, I think it's people, anybody who moved west had to let go of a lot of their, is that Neil saying we should end it?
No,
Oh, do you want to say something then?
yes.
Okay, feel free.
I have a gentleman with me right now who is really against all electronics and anything modern. His name's Toby Eisler.
Oh, I know Toby.
Yeah, both of his parents were buried up at the one here in Reno. One other comment. Of course, I want to thank Sharon. This has been a great program. But I do have all of the newsreel stuff from early in the 20th century, and we have the setting of the cornerstone for the Temple Manuel. So we might want to try and pull that off the flash drive that I have. All of this film was just barely saved. It was going up in smoke, hot spots and stuff with it. I got it from Carl Shelley. And we were able to save a whole bunch of it. A lot of it is pretty good and a lot of it is pretty damn questionable, but you'd be welcome to take a look at it.
You're saying of the original, Neil, you're saying of the original, the 1921 Temple,
Yes.
Temple Emmanuel.
This is real early stuff. These
Holy
are
moly, I would really love to see
these are
that.
newsreel stuff and a lot of real good stuff on the train systems and just everything that was
Oh,
going
I
on.
bet.
Yeah, it's pretty special, but I'd be happy to share that with you. And again, I just wanted to butt in and thank you for taking the time, effort, and I bragged about your research and all the rest of it, and you certainly lived up to it. So I'm going to sign off and get out of the way here.
Well, bye. If there are other people who had questions who are not signing off, I can hang in. It's up to you.
There was, so I just think as a general, like you said, people had to give up their, other
Which
rituals,
organization?
and
Yeah.
and they got involved in other groups heading west, and so
Right.
I've seen that where sometimes people have many things on their headstones, others not. So
Right. I just want to say, it's always you get to pick who you are. But if, so you're right, many people would be like my grandfather was a Mason, for instance.
Mhm.
But ultimately, I think for some people, more historically, people who where religion plays a more important part of their life, they want to be in a consecrated cemetery, whether it be Catholic, whether it be Jewish. There's a reason why they have all these different sections within cemeteries. It's because people want to be among their own with the right, so that consecrated area, I think, extends to other religions as well. But, or how I mentioned the Platts in Carson City, that one brother was in a Hebrew cemetery, but Samuel was here in the Masonic, in Reno at the Masonic. So you get to pick, or your family gets to pick. And I will say, anybody who has a strong preference, what you want being done once you die, write it down, make your needs well known, because you can't control it once you're gone.
that's definitely true, and you're right. And if you join fraternal orders, you had an opportunity to buy into their cemeteries too, and then if your families want to join that too, so that definitely was another benefit.
And let me add something that I didn't get into. I believe this is still true. It's always been that if you are a member in a paid part of a congregation, either Emmanuel or Sinai, you are entitled to a free easement there. As long as you are a current member, then if that time came, you could be buried there. You still have to pay for the cost of the actual hole digging and that sort of thing, but you're not paying for a plot the way that traditionally people would buy a plot of land.
Yeah, and that definitely would help with costs too.
Yeah.
So there was a nice comment. Sharon, you always add something more to this interesting topic. Glad I decided to listen to your talk again.
Who is it?
It was Lorraine. So
I
I thought that was nice.
Yeah, Lorraine's good.
Oh, so there's a comment. Sharon mentioned that the Hebrew Cemetery in Reno is used, I think, only for the Reform and the conservative synagogues. What cemetery does the Orthodox community use?
That is such a good question, and I really do not know, which isn't to say that they couldn't be. I don't know. That's something I should look into. It's hard to believe that they're being carted off somewhere else. So I don't know. I'll probably never do this again because I think I've exhausted all the audiences. But I will find out where do the Orthodox go? Because they
Yeah,
also, Orthodox typically do not believe in cremation either.
Right.
So the body's got to go somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had mentioned John Marshall's book, of course, and we actually have his research notes as part of our Historical Society collection here. But no, thank you. This was a wonderful program, and I'm always learning a little something new, and so I'm always writing little notes. And so yeah, it's very interesting, just part of the history of the community, and just some of these cemeteries, like you said, just kind of faded back into the shrubs and the desert, like up in Virginia City. But at least there are groups and people are trying to preserve it. So thank you, Sharon. This was a great talk.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure. I'll have to come up with something else to talk about. Oh, hi, Terry. She's back.
Yay, she's back. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I will give it back to Terry. And thank you guys for hosting our High Noon series.
Well, I love this program. It's such an honor to have hosted. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and a heartfelt thanks to Sherry Hayes Zorn with the Nevada Historical Society, historian Sharon Honig-Bear, the great Neal Cobb, and John, our library system tech wizard, for making this event possible. Have a great day.